It all started subtly enough. For a military guy like me, with years of deployment and structure under my belt, home life wasn't exactly a cakewalk, but I thought we'd adjusted well. Jess, my wife, had always known the demands of my career, coming from a military family herself. She seemed to understand the sacrifices, the late nights, the missed holidays. But looking back, maybe we just swept too much under the rug. One evening, after a 6-month deployment, I finally got home. I could feel something was off almost immediately. I chalked it up to the usual post-deployment readjustment, the awkward familiarity, the feeling like a stranger in your own house. But that night, when I went to change into something comfortable, I found a pair of women's underwear in our bedroom drawer. They were definitely Jess's, but there was something off about them. As strange as it sounds, they didn't smell like her usual perfume. Instead, there was a scent that made my stomach twist, a hint of cologne, unfamiliar and out of place. I tried to push the thought aside, thinking maybe I was being paranoid, seeing things that weren't there. Deployments mess with your mind, but a part of me just couldn't shake it. I tried to brush it off at first, rationalizing that maybe it was just in my head or that Jess had picked up some strange scent from somewhere innocuous. But it gnawed at me, this uneasy feeling that something was wrong. The smell clung to those panties, almost like a mocking reminder that I was the only one who didn't know the truth. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I took a closer look, and that's when I saw it. Tiny, unmistakable stains. It hit me like a punch to the gut. That wasn't my scent. That wasn't from us. I've been in combat zones, facing life or death situations, but nothing could have prepared me for this sickening, hollow feeling. I sat there in silence, just staring, feeling my stomach twist tighter with each second. I wanted to scream, to punch a wall, to confront her right there and then, but I knew I had to keep my head. I'd been away for half a year. Blowing up on her without any explanation would only drive her further away. So I started watching. Over the next few weeks, I kept my cool, though every interaction with Jess felt strained. I could see how she was slightly more distant, making excuses for not being around as much, brushing off my attempts to reconnect. She'd say things like, "I'm just tired," or "Things were hectic while you were gone, so I'm still getting back to normal." But I knew better. One evening, she went out with some of her friends for a girls' night. She'd done this before, but this time everything about it felt calculated. She'd taken longer than usual to get ready, slipping on her best dress, doing her makeup with an extra care she didn't usually bother with anymore, not even for me. She kissed me quickly, hardly meeting my eyes, then turned and left, leaving me with a hollow ache. After she left, I found myself pacing the house, debating if I should just let it go or dig deeper. That gnawing feeling inside, the one that wouldn't let me ignore the signs, won out. I went into our bedroom, opened her drawers, and there they were, another pair of panties tucked away under her other clothes. I picked them up and immediately felt that nauseating twist again. They had the same strange scent, the same faint traces. That's when it clicked for me. I stood there, clutching those panties in my hand, as the reality of it sank in deeper. I didn't want to believe it. This was the woman I'd built a life with, the one I'd married young, just before my first deployment, the one who'd waited for me during every tour, sending letters, photos, the whole deal. Yet there I was, holding physical proof of what I'd tried so hard to deny. The signs had been there, sure, but the evidence? That made it undeniable. With each deployment, there'd been whispers in the back of my mind, wondering if the strain of the distance was wearing on her, if she'd ever crack under the weight of it. But Jess was always a rock. At least she used to be. She had been the one reassuring me, telling me everything was fine at home, that she'd hold down the fort. And until now, I'd believed her. That night, I found myself spiraling. Every tiny interaction with her felt like it took on a whole new meaning. The way she'd been pushing me off in recent weeks, always coming up with some excuse to dodge intimacy. How she'd sometimes seem disconnected, like her mind was miles away. It all began to make sense now, but that didn't make it hurt any less. The worst part was the smell. It lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. I hadn't noticed it on her before, but then again, I hadn't been looking for it. The idea that someone else had been close enough to her, had left that kind of mark on her, it filled me with a level of rage I didn't know I was capable of. But the anger also kept me grounded. It stopped me from falling into despair. I sat in our bedroom, turning everything over in my mind, planning out my next move. I knew I couldn't confront her yet. The last thing I wanted was for her to start lying or twisting things before I had the full story. I didn't need half-truths or excuses. I needed to know everything. So, I decided to gather as much information as I could, starting with her phone. When she got home that night, I acted as normal as I could, though every laugh, every smile I forced felt like it was tearing a little piece out of me. She was surprised to find me awake, but she brushed it off and started heading for the shower. When she disappeared, I slipped her phone off the nightstand. I'd never gone through her phone before, never even felt the need to. But in that moment, the stakes had changed. I wasn't going to stand by, blind, while someone played with my life, my marriage. The first thing I noticed was that she'd set up a password. Jess had never been secretive with her phone before. We had each other's passcodes. But this was different. She had a new lock on it, and my gut told me it wasn't just a casual change. I went to bed that night more determined than ever. If she was hiding something, I would find it. The next day, my mission was clear. If Jess had secrets, I was going to uncover them. But I needed a way around that new passcode. Being in the military had taught me patience and resourcefulness, skills I'd need to dig up her lies. But it was one thing to know I had to do it, and another to go through with it, knowing I'd find things that would break whatever remained of my trust in her. I decided to bide my time and play it cool, pretending everything was fine, letting Jess believe that I was oblivious. The strange thing was she didn't even seem on edge. She carried on like nothing was wrong, completely oblivious to the turmoil boiling inside me. It almost felt like she'd convinced herself that what she was doing was acceptable, that I'd never suspect a thing. That evening, as Jess prepared dinner, I kept my eyes on her, looking for any sign of guilt, any tell that would give her away. But if she felt any shame, she didn't show it. She laughed, joked about our plans for the weekend, and even asked if I wanted to go to a movie that Friday. It felt surreal, like watching a stranger move through my wife's body. But I went along with it, acting like her offer was a great idea, trying to mirror her ease. She had no idea I'd already started piecing things together. Over the next few days, I paid close attention to her phone habits. She'd become more guarded with it, keeping it nearby, barely letting it out of her sight. But the opportunity finally came one night when she left it charging on the kitchen counter while she went to the garage. I seized the moment, grabbing the phone and scanning it for any clues. Of course, the new password blocked me from going further, but I noticed something strange, a second app for messaging. I hadn't noticed it before, but there it was, tucked away among her usual apps. My mind raced with possibilities. Jess wasn't the type to use multiple apps unless she had a specific reason. And the fact that she'd hidden it from view, locked it away behind her new passcode. It was like waving a red flag in my face. Whoever she was talking to, she was hiding it. I put the phone back before she came inside, determined to dig deeper. I couldn't confront her yet, not without proof, but I knew I needed access to that app. It was only a matter of time before I'd figure out how to get it. The realization that my own wife was hiding part of her life from me gnawed at my mind, keeping me up late every night and filling my head with countless questions. Who was this other person? How long had it been going on? And most painfully, why? Jess and I had our ups and downs, sure, but who didn't? I'd always thought we were solid, that we'd built something strong enough to withstand the long deployments, the missed birthdays, the hard months apart. But here I was, lying awake at 2 a.m., wondering if I'd missed signs along the way, wondering if I'd failed her somehow. The next morning, Jess acted as if everything was perfectly normal. She sat across from me at breakfast, scrolling her phone with that look of quiet focus she always had, sipping her coffee like she didn't have a care in the world. I watched her, trying to keep my expression neutral, but every calm blink of hers made my blood simmer just a little more. When she looked up and caught me staring, she gave a small smile. "You're awfully quiet today. Everything all right?" "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind. Work's been intense." She nodded, not pressing further, and I felt a twinge of bitterness. She could believe a lie so easily, because that's exactly what she'd been doing to me. I decided then that I couldn't go another day pretending. I needed to know the truth, needed to peel back the layers of her deception and expose what she was hiding. I waited until she left for work that day. Jess had been taking longer lunches recently, coming home late more often than not, claiming she'd been caught up or swamped. That wasn't her style. She was punctual, almost to a fault, always letting me know if she was running behind. But now, She just breezed through the door with a breezy apology that felt like nothing more than an empty excuse. I figured if she could play the lying game, I could at least take advantage of her absence. The first thing I did was search our home computer, hoping she might have slipped up and left something behind. Nothing. She must have thought ahead. She was careful, methodical. But that phone of hers was the real gateway, the place I knew she kept this double life under wraps. I started researching phone unlocking techniques, combing through articles and online forums that detailed every trick in the book. I read about everything from biometric overrides to pin-breaking software. I couldn't exactly risk using any invasive hacking tools. I needed a discreet way to crack her password. Then, I remembered something from years ago. Jess's habit of using memorable dates for everything. Birthdays, anniversaries, our first date. She used those dates for just about every password she had. The next night, I decided to test the theory. Jess had left her phone in her bag, which was hanging on the coat rack in our hallway. I waited until she was asleep, her steady breathing the only sound in the room, before I quietly slipped out of bed, went to the coat rack, and gently unzipped her bag. There it was, resting near the top, her phone that had suddenly become the key to understanding what had happened to our marriage. I took the phone and slipped into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. The screen glowed faintly as I entered our anniversary, holding my breath, hoping it was the right code. Nothing. I tried her birthday. No luck. My mind raced, combing through memories, all the dates that meant something to us. And then it hit me, the date of my first deployment. It was something she'd marked on the calendar every year, always reminding me how it felt like the start of her life as a military spouse. I entered the date, and the screen unlocked. A mix of triumph and dread washed over me as I accessed her messages, scrolling through until I found the app she'd hidden. It was full of recent conversations, the chat history thick with messages that made my pulse race. At first, I saw nothing particularly incriminating, chit-chat about day-to-day life, jokes, work gripes. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. Messages from a contact saved under T took on an unmistakably flirtatious edge, with inside jokes I'd never heard of, plans for dinners and drinks, messages at odd hours. Then at the bottom of the thread, one message stood out, a simple one that burned itself into my memory. Last night was perfect. I felt the bile rise in my throat as I stared at those words, unable to believe what I was seeing. My mind reeled as I imagined the scenes behind that message, the quiet, intimate moments she'd shared with another man. Each word in that message was like a knife, cutting away at the image of the life I thought we had together. Before I could scroll any further, I heard a noise from the bedroom, the faint rustling of Jess moving in her sleep. Panic surged through me. I quickly exited the messages, locked the phone, and placed it back in her bag. Quietly, I made my way back to the bedroom, slipping into bed just as Jess stirred, her hand reaching across the bed to touch my arm. She sighed softly, still half asleep, her fingers grazing my shoulder as she mumbled, "You okay, babe?" "Yeah." I lied, keeping my voice steady. "Just had trouble sleeping." I lay there next to her, wide awake, while she drifted back to sleep, her breathing steady and calm. The warmth of her hand on my shoulder felt wrong, like a mask covering up something ugly underneath. I wanted to pull away, but I held still, each heartbeat throbbing with rage and betrayal. I lay awake, the darkness around me feeling heavy, suffocating. I realized that this was just the beginning, that I couldn't unsee what I'd just uncovered. And now, knowing that the truth was worse than I'd ever imagined, I braced myself for whatever I'd find next. That night stretched on forever. I stayed awake, listening to Jess's steady breathing, feeling the weight of what I'd uncovered pressing down on me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that message again. Last night was perfect. It taunted me, playing on repeat, driving home the fact that another man had shared moments with her that used to be mine alone. The next morning, I could barely look at her. Jess was still unaware of what I'd found, greeting me with a sleepy smile as she poured herself a cup of coffee. She seemed so natural, so unaffected, like she hadn't a single worry in the world. I couldn't help but wonder how long she'd been carrying on like this, living a double life right under my nose. Had she ever felt guilty? Was she still with him, mentally, even as she smiled at me? I sat across from her at the kitchen table, masking my thoughts, nodding along to whatever casual conversation she was trying to make. I barely heard her words, My mind was spinning with plans, weighing options, trying to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to throw her phone across the table and demand the truth. But another part of me held back, knowing I needed more than just vague suspicions and a single damning message. After breakfast, Jess left for work as usual, breezing out the door with her usual, "Have a good day," that felt hollow now. The moment she was gone, I was back on her phone, determined to uncover the full extent of her betrayal. This time, I took screenshots of every message between her and T, sending them to myself so I could go over them in detail later. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a kind of torture, like I needed to feel the depth of the betrayal to finally accept that this was really happening. I read through each exchange, noticing the shifts in tone, the way their messages grew more affectionate over time. It was all there, flirty compliments, inside jokes, casual chats about their days, and then the intimacy I'd feared most. Messages arranging times to meet up, suggestions to skip lunch and head to a nearby hotel, sweet goodbyes that hinted at so much more than I could bear. It was like reading a diary written by someone I didn't know, like this version of Jess was a stranger wearing her face. One message made me pause. It was from a couple of weeks back, right before I'd returned from my last deployment. She told him, "Just a few more days until he's back. Gotta be careful." The casualness of it gutted me. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the fact that she'd planned it all out, calculated the risks, and decided I wasn't a big enough threat to stop her. I finally learned T's real name from one of the earlier messages, Thomas. The name felt alien, like a bad taste in my mouth. And yet I knew him, or at least I knew of him. He was one of Jess's co-workers, someone she'd introduced me to at a few work functions over the years. He'd seemed unassuming enough at the time, always polite and respectful, the type who blended into the background without drawing much attention. I'd never had any reason to suspect him, never noticed anything unusual between him and Jess. But now I couldn't help but wonder if every friendly conversation I'd had with him had been a farce, a performance put on to keep me off the trail. The betrayal stung even more knowing that he'd been in our home, had sat across from me at our dinner table, all while hiding this affair with Jess. I tried to think back, to see if there were signs I'd missed. Those moments when Jess would light up talking about work, laughing at jokes that I wasn't in on, the late-night texts she'd brush off with an "oh, just work stuff." All those little things I'd dismissed, chalked up to stress or routine, had been clues I hadn't put together. The anger simmered in me, a relentless, burning feeling that kept pushing me to take action. I knew I had enough evidence to confront her now, but the thought of it terrified me. I wasn't afraid of the confrontation itself. I could handle that. What I feared was what would come after, the way everything we'd built would crumble. Our home, our life, our shared years, all of it felt like it was balancing on the edge of a cliff. But I couldn't avoid it. I couldn't go on pretending nothing was wrong. That night, I made my decision. I'd talk to her, but I'd wait until she was least expecting it. Maybe catch her in one of her lies just to see if she'd try to deny it, if she'd lie right to my face. So, the next morning, when Jess casually mentioned she'd be working late again, I played along, nodding and giving her my usual "be safe" as she left. I waited for her to go, giving her a few minutes to get a head start before I followed, keeping my distance as I tailed her car. It felt absurd, surreal, like I was in some bad detective movie, but I had to know. Sure enough, she wasn't heading to work. She took a different route, one that led to a small, out-of-the-way hotel on the outskirts of town. My stomach dropped as I watched her park and walk inside, dressed just a little too nicely for an average workday. I parked a few spaces away, waiting, trying to gather my thoughts. I knew if I followed her inside, it would all be over. I'd finally see the truth I'd been dreading, and there'd be no going back from it. But as I sat there, staring at the hotel entrance, the anger boiled over. I couldn't sit there and do nothing, couldn't just let her slip away again. With every step toward that hotel door, my heart pounded harder. I felt like a ghost, watching myself from the outside, detached, numb. I walked up to the front desk, my voice calm as I asked if Mr. Thomas had checked in, explaining I was meeting him for a business matter. The clerk nodded, confirming his room number without a second thought. Room 214. I stood there, looking at that door, feeling the weight of every choice I'd made that had led me here. In that moment, everything felt heavy, almost unbearable, but I knew I couldn't turn back. And then, With a steadying breath, I knocked. As I stood there, hands still lingering on the doorframe, I could hear muffled sounds from the other side of the door. The soft hum of voices, an occasional laugh. Sounds that should have belonged in our home, between Jess and me, not here in some cheap hotel room with another man. The anger that had been simmering in me boiled over. But I forced myself to keep calm. I knew that I had to see this through, had to face whatever was happening on the other side of that door. After a few moments, I heard footsteps approach. The door opened, and there was Jess, standing there with a look of complete shock, her face going pale as she took in the sight of me. She froze, her mouth opening as if to say something, but no words came. Behind her, I could see him, Thomas, looking just as stunned, his face registering a flicker of fear. For a second, I felt everything I wanted to say crowding up in my throat, each question sharper than the last. Why? How could she do this to us? How could she throw everything we had away for this man? This guy who didn't deserve even a shred of what we'd built together. But instead, I kept my voice low and steady. So, this is it, I said, looking directly at her, ignoring Thomas completely. This is where you've been. Jess didn't answer right away. She just stood there, as if her silence could somehow undo what I just walked in on. But after a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. It's not what it looks like, okay? It just got complicated. Complicated? I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. Jess, this isn't complicated. This is betrayal. Thomas cleared his throat, looking like he was ready to bolt, but I raised a hand, stopping him. Don't even think about it, Thomas. You're not going anywhere until we finish this. He stiffened, nodding slightly, his face paling as he stood there, caught in the very situation he'd probably thought he could avoid by being discreet. I stepped inside the room, my eyes fixed on Jess. She took a step back, glancing at Thomas, who had shrunk into the corner of the room, looking like he'd rather be anywhere but here. I could see the panic in Jess's eyes, the way she was calculating, probably searching for a way to spin this, a way to turn this mess into some kind of understandable mistake. But there was no explaining this away. How long has this been going on? I asked, my voice rough with suppressed anger. Jess hesitated, biting her lip as her gaze dropped to the floor. She didn't answer immediately, which only made my anger intensify. How long, Jess? I repeated, more forcefully this time. A few months, she finally said, her voice so quiet I barely heard her. Since you got back last time, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. So, all that time, you were with him? While I was right there, right in our own home. She looked up at me, eyes glistening with something that looked like regret, but it was too little, too late. I didn't mean for it to happen, she murmured, as if that could make any of this easier to swallow. It just we got close at work, and I didn't want to hurt you. Didn't want to hurt me? I repeated, laughing bitterly. Jess, you didn't just hurt me. You shattered everything. Our whole life. All those years. It meant nothing to you, did it? Thomas tried to speak up, muttering something about how he hadn't wanted to cause any harm, but I cut him off, my gaze sharp. I don't want to hear a word from you. You think this is just some casual thing, something you can brush off? This is my wife. My life. You had no right. He swallowed, nodding slightly, and I could see the shame on his face. It didn't make a difference to me. He was as guilty as she was, if not more. I turned back to Jess. So what now? I asked, my voice softer, the anger giving way to something colder, emptier. You've got what you wanted, right? Was it worth it? Tears filled her eyes, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the woman I'd once known, the woman I'd built a life with standing there. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said, her voice breaking. It was just, I was lonely, okay? I felt like you were gone, even when you were home, like I was living alone. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought maybe I could just, I don't know, find something I felt was missing. Find something missing? I repeated, the words hollow and bitter. And what about me? Did it ever cross your mind to talk to me about it? To tell me you were struggling? Instead, you went behind my back and let him. I jerked my head toward Thomas. Fill in the gaps? Jess wiped her tears, shaking her head as she struggled to find words. But there was nothing she could say that would make this right. The weight of her choices, the years we'd shared, they all crashed down around us in that cramped, cheap hotel room, stripping away any illusions I might have held on to. Maybe Maybe I made a mistake, she whispered, her voice breaking again. I didn't want it to end like this. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply to keep my composure. The anger, the betrayal, the years of trust, all of it was unraveling, and I didn't know if I could hold it together. Finally, I opened my eyes, giving her one last look. Jess, whatever we had, it's over. I can't unsee what I saw here. Can't pretend like you didn't make a choice. You chose him. You chose this, I said, gesturing around the room, and you chose to throw it all away. With that, I turned and walked out, leaving Jess and Thomas standing there, their guilty silence hanging heavy in the air. As I stepped out into the hallway, a strange, eerie calm settled over me, a quiet resignation. I knew that this was the end of one chapter of my life. It was painful, more than anything I'd ever experienced, but as I walked away, I felt the beginning of something else, a fierce, determined strength to rebuild my life without her. As I drove home that night, every mile felt like it added weight to the pit in my stomach. The confrontation had played out exactly how I dreaded it might. Jess's shock, her pathetic excuses, her tears. I'd hoped she would own up to it, to at least show some remorse that went beyond surface-level regret. But as her words echoed in my mind, I could see how empty they really were. I thought back to a night a few years back, one that had always left me feeling uneasy, even though I tried to bury it in the past. It had been just before one of my deployments, a shorter one, 3 months. Jess and I had decided to have a small get-together with friends and neighbors to lift the mood before I left. It was a good night, one I'd remembered fondly, or at least, that's what I had told myself. But looking back, there had been something that had felt off about her that night. Toward the end of the evening, as people started to leave, Jess had pulled me aside to ask if I'd mind if she stayed back to help our neighbor, Nick, clean up. I hadn't thought much of it then. Nick was recently divorced, a bit of a mess, and Jess had always been sympathetic to people like that. It didn't seem odd at the time, just one neighbor helping another. She'd insisted she'd only be a few minutes, and I'd gone home, thinking nothing of it. But an hour passed, then another, and I started getting impatient. I texted her, asking if she was still at Nick's, and she replied, saying they'd lost track of time, and that she'd be home soon. By the time she finally got back, it was nearly midnight. I remember teasing her, asking if she was planning on moving in with Nick at this rate. She'd brushed it off with a laugh, her cheeks a little flushed, mumbling something about Nick needing someone to talk to. It had bothered me, sure, but Jess was so convincing, and we were about to be separated again for months. I hadn't wanted to ruin our last night together by starting a fight over what seemed like nothing. But I couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling, and something in her tone that night had seemed rehearsed, a bit too casual. I'd chalked it up to my own paranoia, my mind playing tricks on me. But now, driving back home alone, I felt that old suspicion flare up like a wound reopening. I hadn't thought about that night in years, but now, with everything I'd seen and heard, it all came flooding back. The lingering look between them that night, her blush, the way she'd taken a bit too long to come home. When I got back to the house, I sat in the car for a long time, piecing it all together. Every suspicious moment, every odd glance or late night she'd chalked up to something innocent. It felt like peeling back layers of a lie that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. I went inside, the quiet of the house feeling heavier than it ever had before. Jess's things were all around me. Her favorite coffee mug, the throw blanket she always used on movie nights, her slippers by the door. This had been our life, the one I thought was built on trust, on all the sacrifices we'd both made to stay together. But now, that life felt like a sham, a series of lies I'd been blind to because I wanted so desperately to believe in us. Unable to shake the memory of that night with Nick, I did something I never thought I'd do. I called him. I hadn't spoken to Nick in years. He'd moved away not long after that night, and we'd lost touch. The phone rang a few times before he picked up, his voice groggy, like I'd woken him up. "Hey, Nick, it's me," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "Hey, man, long time no talk," he replied, clearly surprised. "What's going on?" I hesitated, feeling a lump in my throat. I needed to ask you something about Jess. From a while back." There was a long pause, and I could almost feel his discomfort through the phone. He cleared his throat, his voice dropping. "Yeah, sure, what's up? Do you remember that night before I deployed, when you guys had the party?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, though my heart was pounding. "Jess stayed back to help you clean up, and well, I don't know, man, I just have this feeling." Was there something going on between you two? Silence. I could hear him breathing on the other end, but he didn't say anything. My pulse quickened, every second of that silence confirming what I already knew deep down. Nick, I pressed, my voice coming out harsher than I'd intended. He sighed, the sound heavy, full of regret. Look, man, it was a long time ago, and it was stupid. It was just one time, all right? We were both drinking, and she was upset about you leaving. One thing led to another. His voice trailed off, the words hanging in the air like a sentence being read aloud. I felt a mix of rage and betrayal wash over me, my fists clenching involuntarily. I wanted to yell, to scream at him for what he'd done, but what would be the point? The damage was already done. The betrayal wasn't just from that night or from Thomas. It was years deep, a history of deceit she'd built while pretending to be the loving wife waiting for me to come home. You should have told me. I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. You owed me that much. I know, man. I'm sorry. I thought it would only make things worse. I never wanted to come between you two. Too late for that. I replied bitterly before hanging up. I sat there in the darkness, feeling like my entire world had collapsed around me. Everything I'd built, every sacrifice I'd made to protect our life, our marriage, felt meaningless. She betrayed me once, years ago, and then had the audacity to do it again. And I'd been none the wiser, trusting her, letting her convince me she was as committed to this life as I was. I knew what I had to do now. There was no coming back from this, no forgiveness, no moving on. Jess and I were done. The woman I'd trusted, who I'd built my life with, had been nothing but a lie all along. And as I sat there, feeling the weight of everything settle around me, I realized that I was finally ready to let go. The next morning felt like waking up in someone else's life. Everything around me looked the same. Our bed, Jess's side with her pillow still indented from the night before, the framed photo of us from our first anniversary on the nightstand, but none of it felt real. It was like our home had turned into a museum of memories, all of them tainted, all of them empty reminders of the life I thought I'd had. I had barely slept after the call with Nick, replaying his words over and over in my mind. It was more than just anger. It was the ache of betrayal that went beyond anything I'd felt before. Learning about the affair with Thomas was one thing, but finding out it went back further, that Jess had been living this double life for years, turned my stomach. Jess came into the kitchen, greeting me with a quick smile as she poured herself coffee, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. She was good at it, pretending everything was normal, acting like she was the faithful wife. It made my blood boil, just watching her move so casually through the house, talking about plans for the day, asking if I needed anything from the grocery store. I think we need to talk, I said finally, unable to stand a charade any longer. She paused, her hand halfway to her coffee cup, her expression shifting slightly. Okay, what's on your mind? I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't see the point. I know, Jess. I know everything. About you and Thomas. About Nick. The names landed heavily between us, like gunshots, each one stripping away the illusion she'd tried to keep intact. Her face went pale, her eyes wide with shock. What are you talking about? Don't. I snapped, the anger in my voice sharper than I intended. Don't insult me by pretending you don't know. I confronted Thomas, and I talked to Nick. They both told me what happened. So don't stand there and lie to my face again. For a moment, she just stared at me, her face a mixture of shock and fear, like a child caught with her hand in the cookie jar. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. It was as if she hadn't prepared herself for this, hadn't anticipated that I'd ever find out. After a long, tense silence, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry. It was a mistake both times. It didn't mean anything, I swear. I was lonely, and I felt like you weren't really there anymore, like I was going through everything alone. Alone? I echoed, my voice laced with bitterness. I was on deployments, Jess. I was halfway around the world, putting my life on the line, thinking you were here waiting for me. Meanwhile, you were playing house with two different men behind my back. Tears filled her eyes, and she started to reach out toward me. But I took a step back, my whole body tensing. I didn't want her touch. It felt like poison. I was trying to keep us together, she said, her voice trembling. I know it doesn't make sense, but I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want to hurt you. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. You didn't want to hurt me? Jess, you destroyed me. You lied to me for years, made me believe in a life that was just a fantasy. You let me think I was coming home to a faithful wife while you were busy finding comfort with other men. She broke down then, the tears streaming down her face, but I felt nothing but a cold, steely detachment. The woman crying in front of me wasn't my wife, not the one I thought I'd married. She was a stranger, someone who'd kept up appearances, someone who'd played the role of devoted wife while keeping me in the dark. Is there anything else? I asked, my voice flat, emotionless. Anyone else you want to tell me about? She shook her head, her gaze dropping to the floor. No, it was just those times. I'm sorry, so sorry. I know I can't make it right, but I want to try. Please, just give me a chance to fix this. I took a deep breath, looking at her, trying to see if there was any sincerity left in those tear-filled eyes. But all I felt was exhaustion. I'd given her the benefit of the doubt once before, trusted her with everything I had, and she'd shattered that trust not once, but twice. Fix this? I repeated, my voice hollow. Jess, you don't fix something by breaking it over and over. I don't know who you are anymore. I don't even know who I was to you. A convenience? Someone you could fall back on when things got boring. Her face crumpled, and she took a shaky breath. No, you're my husband, the only person I ever wanted to be with. I know I messed up. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm begging you, please don't give up on us. The words felt like a plea, a desperate attempt to salvage what was already gone. And maybe there was a part of me that wanted to believe her, that wanted to find a way back to the life we'd built. But then I remembered the hotel, the phone messages, Nick's words that confirmed the betrayal went back even further than I'd known. I'm done, Jess. I said, each word firm, final. I can't do this anymore. You can't fix what you destroyed. She broke down completely, sobbing as she covered her face with her hands. But I felt no sympathy, no desire to comfort her. Instead, I turned, heading toward the door. I needed air, space to clear my head. This house, our house, felt tainted. Every room a reminder of the lies she'd built around us. As I walked outside, a strange calm settled over me. The betrayal, the lies, the years I'd spent with her. They were behind me now. A chapter 1 was ready to close. There was no going back, no salvaging a life built on deception. And as I stood there, watching the morning sun rise, I knew one thing for certain. I was finally free from the illusion. Leaving the house that morning felt like walking away from a war zone. The air was thick, tense, as if even the walls carried the weight of everything Jess and I had been through. But once I was outside, I felt the beginnings of relief, a small sliver of clarity in an otherwise dark moment. I walked down the street, not sure where I was going, just needing to be somewhere else, somewhere without memories of her. I ended up at the small park a few blocks away. Sitting on one of the benches, I stared at the empty playground, letting the silence settle over me. The memories were relentless, though, flashing through my mind like an unwanted slideshow. Our first apartment, cramped and noisy, but filled with laughter. The night she'd sat on the couch, waiting for me to come home from base. The anniversaries where we'd promised each other forever. Now I saw those memories for what they were, a facade. Jess had been lying to me for years, fooling me while I'd been out there, living each day for the both of us, trusting that she'd always be waiting on the other end. The memory of my phone call with Nick the night before kept surfacing, each word he'd said like a fresh wound. He'd claimed it was just one time, and that he'd been drunk, lonely, vulnerable. But it wasn't the one time with him that really stung. It was the fact that she'd done it again with Thomas right under my nose so recently that it felt like it was still happening. I sat there for what must have been hours, watching the light change as the morning slipped into midday. Eventually, I heard footsteps approaching, and when I looked up, it was my friend Adam from base, one of the few people I trusted. He'd been my closest confidant during deployments, the guy I could count on when things got rough. Adam didn't ask why I was sitting there alone, looking like my whole world had crumbled. He just nodded and sat down next to me, waiting in that quiet, steady way he had. After a while, he handed me a coffee, saying, "Figured you could use this." I took it, grateful for the distraction, even if only for a moment. We sat there in silence for a while, both of us staring ahead. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low. Jess, huh? I nodded, feeling a fresh wave of bitterness well up in me. How'd you know? He shrugged. You've been different since you got back. I figured something was up. I just didn't think it'd be this bad. I let out a sigh, the weight of it all spilling out. She was seeing someone else. Hell, she's been doing this for years. First with Nick, now with Thomas. The whole time I was out there, thinking she was waiting for me, she was just living a lie. Adam was quiet for a moment, nodding slowly, his face set with understanding. I've seen it happen before, man. The distance, the time apart, it gets to people, but that doesn't make it any easier, doesn't make it right. I swallowed, struggling to keep my emotions in check. I gave her everything, Adam. All those years, all the sacrifices. I thought we were solid. Sometimes we don't see what's right in front of us, he said, his tone gentle but firm. You're loyal to a fault. Always have been. But that doesn't mean she was. The truth in his words cut deep. I'd held on to that loyalty like it was my lifeline, like it could hold us together through anything. But Jess hadn't honored it. She'd taken advantage of it, used it to hide her secrets, knowing I'd never suspect her. Adam gave my shoulder a squeeze. What are you going to do now? I took a long breath, the decision that had been forming in my mind all morning finally solidifying. Divorce. There's nothing left to save. She made that choice when she decided to live a double life. I can't be with someone I don't trust. He nodded in agreement, a look of quiet respect in his eyes. Good. Don't let her keep you chained to this. You got a lot of life ahead of you. Don't let her mistakes define it. We sat there for a while longer, the silence settling around us again, but this time it felt different. Adam's presence was grounding, a reminder that I wasn't alone, even in the face of everything falling apart. When I finally got up to leave, he stood with me, giving me a firm handshake. If you need anything, I'm here. You know that. Thanks, Adam, I said, feeling a small sliver of strength returning. I think I'll be all right. Just need to get through this. I walked back home, knowing it would probably be one of the last times I'd ever walk through that door. As I stepped inside, the emptiness of the place struck me. Jess was gone, and the silence was deafening, but it felt cleaner somehow, as if her leaving had lifted some of the weight. I started packing, taking my clothes, my gear, the essentials. I didn't need much. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. As I went through our things, I came across the small box where we kept mementos, photos, little souvenirs from vacations, the ticket stubs from our first date. I took one last look at them before closing the box, knowing these memories didn't hold the same meaning anymore. Just as I was about to leave, I found a handwritten note from Jess tucked inside the box. It was from years ago, back when we'd first gotten married, her handwriting neat and full of love. Wherever you go, whatever happens, I'll be here. Forever. The words felt hollow now, an empty promise that had been broken long ago. I put the note back, closing the box and leaving it on the table. Those memories belonged to a past I was ready to leave behind. With a final look around, I walked out, locking the door behind me, feeling the first real sense of freedom I'd felt in years. As I left the house, the weight of finality settling over me, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. I'd walked away from Jess and the tangled web of lies she'd spun around us, but there was no escaping the ache of what could have been. I was ready to rebuild, to move on from the wreckage of our life together. I started driving, not sure where I was headed, just needing to be away from the memories that still clung to every corner of that house. I thought about stopping by Adam's place, maybe grabbing a beer and clearing my head, but before I could even get my bearings, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number, a local area code. Normally, I'd let it go to voicemail, but something about it made me pick up. Hello, Mr. Davidson? A woman's voice, calm and professional, but carrying a weight that immediately put me on edge. Yes, this is he. This is Officer Stevens with the Highway Patrol. I'm calling regarding your wife, Jessica Davidson. I'm afraid there's been an accident. The words hit me like a blow. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I processed what she was saying. What? What happened? Your wife's car was involved in a collision earlier this morning. She was pronounced dead at the scene. I'm so sorry. The officer's words blurred as my mind reeled, struggling to comprehend. Jess was gone? I just left her, walked out on our life together, and now, just hours later, she was gone? The finality of it, The brutal, unexpected end felt surreal, as if I were standing outside my own life, watching it unfold from a distance. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands trembling as I tried to process it. I'd wanted closure, but not like this. This was the ultimate, irreversible end, and it was like the universe had played the last move in a game I thought I could control. Jess, with all her faults, all her betrayals, was still the woman I'd loved once, the one I'd built a life around. Now, all the anger, the bitterness, felt small and hollow in the face of her death. I hung up, sitting there in silence, staring out at the empty road stretching in front of me. There was no going back, no last conversation, no explanation, no apologies. It was over in the most absolute sense, and the weight of it settled deep within me. And in that quiet moment, I realized something that I hadn't let myself admit before. Despite everything, some part of me had still hoped we could find a way back to each other, that there was some sliver of her I could still hold on to. But now, that hope was gone, along with the life we'd built, scattered like ashes on the wind. With a heavy heart, I started the car again, feeling the strange peace of finality, of endings that come without warning. I drove on, the road ahead open and empty, carrying with me the weight of what had been, and the faint glimmer of whatever might come next. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow.